Marilyn is a Senior Director of User Experience at BetterWorks. Her passion is designing and building experiences that delight users and maximizes productivity. She has worked at MarkLogic, Guidewire, Genentech, Intuit, Oracle, and Xerox. We are excited to hear her UX insights. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm very glad to see there are still people trickling in. So I'll just, but I have 20 minutes. And for those of you who've been attending sessions, you know that 20 minutes is very short. So I'm going to go through quite a number of slides. I will talk fast. I'm from New York. I can talk very fast. And at the end, there will hopefully be time for questions. And if not, my email address will be on the last slide. And I'm happy to take questions by email. So feel free to do that. So I'm just going to jump right into this. Background for me, I started as a developer and doing front-end work, working very closely with UX people. Ended up doing transition into doing UX full-time many years ago and have been leading UX teams for a long time. So I've done this many times at different companies and I've kind of worked out what I think works best. So let's talk about how UX teams evolve in a company. So generally, the first thing that needs to happen is there needs to be an appetite for a team to exist. So there are many companies out there, including the one I'm at right now, which start off with nobody having the role of UX. That usually product managers and developers kind of partner on this. If there is a product manager, sometimes it's just a developer who kind of knows the front end. So really, it's about having people understand what it means to have a UX team. And we're going to go into detail on this in a minute. And then showing the value of such a team. Okay, now I understand it, but why is it important for me to spend headcount and time? Why is it important for me to invest? Because value is about your investment and what you get out of your investment. And then working on so now you get to a point where a team can exist. How does that team collaborate with the rest of the organization? And then finally, how can the UX team become strategic partners in the organization? And my background is in companies that deliver software. And so I'm going to really be talking about this in a software development environment, not so much in a marketing or anything like that, but very much in a software development environment. Although a lot of what I'm going to talk about is very applicable to different environments. So let's talk about this. So the Nielsen Norman Group, highly recommend this website if you're doing anything in UX. Has this concept of stages of UX maturity. And if we look at the evolution of how you build a UX team, it really tracks to these stages of maturity. So you have to build the appetite. You're building the appetite when you're in these very early stages where there isn't a UX team, where it's just people have no idea what UX is. And if you're very lucky at this point, you might be able to get one person who would be a generalist. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. And really, this is about the appetite can come from uncovering negative user experiences. So let me talk about that. A lot of the appetite comes from people saying, well, they don't even understand what it means to do UX. UX is often seen, and I'll talk about this in a minute, as pretty pictures. So you need to make sure they know what UX is, understand the benefits of it, and overcoming some fears. So I want to get into this a little bit. So UX is usually seen as the pictures on the screens. So can you design me a dialog box? Can you make a pretty image for this? Those are really the two things that most people think UX is. And I use UX as user experience as opposed to user interface design or anything like that, because I consider UX is a very all-encompassing profession where you have interaction design, and that's like what controls do you put on the screen and in what order do people click on things, and that's interaction design. And then you have to make it look nice, and that's the visual design. And behind all that, you really have to do research to build software to build designs that match user expectations, that match the environments they work in, that answer the questions they need answers, that get the jobs done they need done. Not just, this sounds like a good idea. Let me give you an example. I was doing a UX design for people who determine insurance rates. I know that sounds really dry, but it was great gig at Guidewire. And in fact, I got a patent for this. And what we did was we talked to people who do that, which are actuaries. And actuaries, it turns out, live and breathe Excel. So and had we not talked to them and done the research, we wouldn't have known that. So the interface that we designed, we made it as close to Excel as we could, and we allowed import and export to and from Excel so that actuaries could work in their native environment and then bring that into the tool at Guidewire. So really important to understand where people live, and then what words do they use when you talk to actuaries. They use various terms, and we had to make sure that we knew what terms to use so that our design could parallel that, how they think. So the information architecture, so how we lay things out and what hierarchy could match what they were doing. And this is super important to understand all of these different um, aspects of UX and be able to explain that to people if you're evangelizing this. So the other thing is, why should we do this? What's the value? Okay, so there's a couple of values. One is, if you design things better, the company does better. And this is super important. This is, these statistics are a little old at this point, but it really shows that design-centric companies do better because their products do better. And there's a lot of literature out there about this. And there's a cost involved. So there's cost and benefits, and that's what value is about. And there's many iterations of this particular picture out there in the universe. So this is kind of a short one where customers can explain what they want, and it's often not what they end up with because we don't actually do the research to watch them work. I remember going into, again at Guidewire, going into insurance offices and listening in on people's phone calls and watching how they worked to see what it was that they really needed. And or else you'll end up with who knows what, because marketing people and salespeople will come up with 1,000 different features, and really the customer needs 3 of them. So there's costs if you don't do that user analysis and design. And this is where we really want to explain that, to help build that appetite, to show, if you don't build what users want, your first version is not going to sell, and you may be dead at that point. Your company may be dead. And this comes, here we've got a quote, because there's a fear involved. There's a fear that, if we put this extra thing in our process, we won't get our software out in as much time. Well, if you think about the software engineering process, in good software engineering, you do architectural design up front, you do your implementation, and then you do code reviews, right? And you wouldn't think of skipping, and then you do QA, and you wouldn't think of skipping any of those parts. It doesn't make sense to skip any of that because your quality will go down. And it's exactly the same argument with user experience. If you don't take the time to design it right, then your development will have to be redone, and you have to redo that whole cycle. So when you talk about in the software engineering process, doing the architecture right up front saves you in the long run. Go back one step even. Doing the user experience right saves you in the architecture, which saves you in the development cost. So it's understanding that that's doing making sure that you do it right, or else it doesn't matter how fast your product gets out there, it won't succeed. So once you've got some kind of appetite, we've talked a little bit about the value, but what usually I've seen is at the very beginning, when you're building the appetite, you're pointing out bad user experiences and say, we could have done this better. And then you say, and this is how it is better. So now you start looking at touching those user experiences to improve them and say, this is what we have. We've gotten a lot of complaints about it. Here is a redesign, and you see how much better it could be. And the little light bulbs start going on for people. Okay. So, and this is where you point out, look, we have one function that works this way on this screen, and look, that same function works differently on another screen. It's not consistent. Look, we can have one design and users will be able to use them better, because they'll understand how to use that same function in both places. And this is where your team might grow to just be kind of generalist still, but having strengths in those 3 areas. Like one might be a slightly better visual designer, one might be an interaction designer, and one might be a researcher, for example, but they all have to be able to cross-pollinate. When I joined Guidewire, I was the only UX person there. And I am in those 3 areas. My weakness is in visual design. I can do it, but I'm kind of the B team. And so when I got hired on there, I said, I'm going to have to spend some money to hire a visual designer to assist me when it comes to visual design issues. And they were fine with that. So they understood what they were getting there. And then my next hire was very strong in visual design, although she could do interaction design and research. So you build up the team with these different strengths. And also, you show over and over again, look how we can improve existing user experiences, or you build new experiences that are people look at and go, oh, that's great. And that it feeds itself. As you design better experiences, you get more support and you can build better experiences. When you've got a team in place, that's the time where you really have to think about structure. And I'm going to talk about that in just a minute, how you actually structure your team. This is where you really need to have processes in place to make sure that you are part of the team collaboration. What I mean by that is that there is, and we're going to talk about this in just a minute, there's early on ideation, then there should be design, and then architecture, and then development, and then QA. So it's a linear process. I mean, it repeats itself in cycles, and there's agile work and things like that, but it's basically that same process. And figuring out where UX fits in with each of those processes is very important, and that's what allows you to design truly outstanding user interfaces. And at this point in a team, you start to have more specialists. You start to have people who are like the UX research lead, okay, or the visual design lead who owns your style guide, for example. Okay, and then when the organization truly has maturity in terms of UX, you start to be a strategic partner. You start actually saying, here's a whole initiative that's going to drive the product. Here's a whole area of the product that we're not doing, but it will make the overall experience better. And this is where people wouldn't even dream, actually, hopefully in the step 4, people wouldn't even dream of not having the UX team. So it's very, very important to sort of strive for this, where you end up having an architect who oversees everything, you have specialists, and you're really a strategic partner in the organization. And in organizations that are mature that I've worked in, I help drive product content because that's part of the strategy. User experience needs to be a core part of the strategy. So let's dive into this a little bit more in terms of process. So I mentioned this a little while ago. There's the product visioning. What are we going to build? What should we be building? Not just, I mean, it could be very broad. What product are we building? Or it could be what features do we need to add? Or what new areas or new ways of thinking? And then there's the design before build process, which is before anybody starts coding anything, except for proof of concept or anything, you do design work. You don't finish it. But I always think about it as building a house. You would never bring a carpenter in until the architect is done. And it doesn't need to be quite as baked as that, because there is agile processing that you can do. But you have to have a pretty good idea of what the house is going to look like before you start, hammering and nailing. And then during the build process, you need to have design come in because there are going to be changes. There are going to be misinterpretations of the design. There are going to be use cases we didn't think of. So there's a partnership that happens there. And then there's an acceptance time when you say, yes, this is the user experience I designed. You have built it the way I expected or we discussed it, and let's ship it. So let's go through each of these. So in product visioning, this is really, it's generally, now I'm going to not say how it should be necessarily, but I'm saying how it generally works well. And this can be different at your company. There can be other people involved in this, but how I've seen it be really successful is you have an owner for the product vision, generally product management and UX, and you do this together. And there are other people involved in this. Usually you have customer people, you have sales, you have marketing giving input, but the key people who decide where are we going with the product, if you have a partnership between product management and UX, that works really well. And this is where you say, what are the use cases? What problems are we trying to solve? What are the requirements there? and really develop that and spec it, write it down, because we all speak different languages, not just actual human communication languages. But I look at things from a user perspective and an artistic perspective, and a product manager looks at it from the functionality perspective and a customer perspective, and I do too look at it from a customer perspective, but we don't often speak the same language. So it's important to write it down. You can't, and this is where, like, taking minutes in meetings where you have agreements, this is good meeting management underlying all of this. And there's tools that can help you. Often you'll have there's tools like Aha. I've got some tools listed along the bottom of some of these slides. Putting together roadmaps to say what we're going to do over different quarters, for example. Writing requirement specs. And by the way, good requirement specs don't say we need a button to blah 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 blah. It should say we need to do blah 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 blah. So requirements are not about design. They're not about what, they're about the what we need, not the how we're going to do it. And there's whole classes on doing requirement specs, so I'm not going to go into that. This is the stage that you, if you haven't already, you do the research. You go in and you talk to people, and you do the things we talked about before. How do they speak? What do they need? What's missing in our current product? And it's really, really important for the UX team to get firsthand exposure to those customers, to be able to have a conversation with them, not have it filtered through a lens of customer people or product people or whatever, but to actually hear those people talk and be able to ask them questions. Very, very important at the product visioning stage. And also that comes in later at the design stage. I can't design for someone that I haven't actually had a conversation with. It just doesn't work very well. So that's product vision. In this decision making, often you, when you decide about what you're going to put in the product, it comes from a lot of sources. It comes from the competition. It comes from, there's sort of just boxes I need to check off to make sure I can even get in the game. We need to fix bugs. And then there's this concept of, oh, this would be cool if we did blah. And all the use cases, all the things that people could think of about doing with the product tend to be created equal when you don't have that UX perspective. Okay, especially when it comes to engineers. Engineers can think of the 35 different use cases, and they want to build all of them, because they tend to. And I'm doing a vast generalization here. I know, no offense to anybody. I used to be an engineer, but really, it's like, well, here's all these different options. I need to code all of them. But what we really want to get to is keeping track of that competitive advantages, making sure we are checking off the boxes, making sure we are fixing the bugs. But what UX brings to the table is, what problems are we solving? How can we streamline the most important use cases to make those easy, the happy path? How can we keep different parts of the product consistent? And making sure that UX bugs are fixed too, not just functional bugs. Okay, so this is where we want to make decisions about what goes in each release, bringing both lenses to the table. Take a breath, moving on. So design before build, this is about, then now it's the UX team. The UX team, so in the earlier stage, the product management team generally drives. In this stage, UX generally drives, and it's a partnership, okay? It's really important to have a design library to say, okay, all of our buttons are going to look like this, and all of our searches are going to work like this, and all of our wizard interactions are going to be like this, so that you get consistency. And you align that with development. You say, okay, you guys build the button once, and everybody uses that same button. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. It's important to track this work to make sure. It's really, really common for a UX person to be working on something and have a product manager go, I need you to add this other feature to this other thing and mock that up. Okay, and so they get sidetracked. UX tends to be very responsive in general. And so, of course, we say yes, right? But it's really important to track that. So when you get behind in your design on this thing because this other thing came on, it's really important to track that and be able to say, hey, this, and to ask for prioritization. Okay, you want me to add this new feature? I can add that new feature, but this other feature that I'm working on is going to slip. And what I often see happening with UX teams is that things just keep getting piled on. And so it's really important to be able to say, Susie is already working on these 4 UX tickets. Which one of these is lower priority than this new thing you're asking about? So it is super important. And to get actual sign off, to say, we are done. So we do that I've done this in several organizations where we do this by having UX tickets for all the work. We often using Jira, all the work with links to the actual designs in something like Figma or Sketch or InVision, okay, and having phases of it's in progress, it's being reviewed, I'm awaiting input, because often you need like a developer to say, is this even implementable, for example, or is this a key feature, or you need something about terminology from a customer. So there's awaiting input as another status, and then design complete. And that's when everybody's given a thumbs up. And so there's a very visible way to say, I'm done with this. I'm putting this aside and moving on to something else. And then anyone who can who needs to look at the design can go to the design complete ticket, which is now linked to the actual design, and see everything. Very, very important that anybody outside the UX team needs a way to find all of your designs in a very structured manner and be able to see what state they're in. So I highly recommend Jira or a similar type of tool for this. The designs can be in whatever you want to use. I've named Figma and Sketch and InVision. You can use whatever tool you want, as long as there's a way for people to get into the designs, see them, and comment on them. That's really important. There needs to be ongoing commentary about your designs, preferably in the designs themselves. And so, but Figma, Sketch, and InVision, they all allow that. And if you're using a different tool, having that functionality is important. Making sure that that you look at competition. And there's this concept of sprint zero. There's a lot of folks who do agile who don't want to do waterfall. I don't do this in any particular order, but I'm sorry. You need to do design before you do development. And maybe that's 3 sprint zeros, depending on the length of your sprints and the amount of design work to do. You have to be planning. I like to tell people you have to plan at least a quarter in advance to do your product and UX work before you start your development sprints. At least, if not more, depending on the size of what you're working on. Okay, moving on. During the build process, again, now we went from product management sort of owning the planning process to UX owning the design process. Dev owns the build process. They're actually putting their fingers on the keyboard. And this is where we really highly recommend, to get good UX, you have a base set of components that the development team uses. So everyone's using the same buttons. So everyone's using the same search functionality. So UX is not designing custom buttons or custom dialogues or custom anything for standard components. So I really like to track the componentry with the design, with the development component library. And now you have to have dev tickets, right? And a lot of us are familiar with this. Often you use Jira for this. But what you need is a designer for every dev ticket that has UX involved. Obviously, backend tickets, you don't have to. But you need a designer who's watching that ticket and tracking it. And there's now a conversation. There's now this teamwork where the designers attend the stand-ups. There's active conversations between the developer and the designer if there's any questions on the design. I've seen organizations where the developer goes to the product manager, who goes to the designer, who goes to the product manager, who goes to the developer, and you end up with this great game of telephone. And that's just not okay. So you need to have this be a team environment. And often you're working on agile sprints, and that's perfectly fine. There's nothing that gets in the way in terms of UX around that. But UX needs to be a part of that conversation during the build process. Okay, and finally, there's an acceptance criteria. And what I mean by this is a built-in process that stories get built by developers, and then when they say they're done, it's an automated process for UX to jump in and do a review. So what I've got on the bottom here is a suggested flow for, say, Jira tickets. When you create the ticket, you set UX required, yes or no, okay? And then the build happens. After design, the build happens. Again, conversations going on. And when the developer says, yep, I think I'm finished, then if there's no UX required, it just goes into QA or whatever your process is. If there's a UX required, then there's a UX review. And I'll talk about the SLA in just a minute. The UX review, the UX person has to have, by the way, the classification, that's the UX required. The UX person needs to have the authority to say no. To say, no, it's not done, and be able to send that back to build. So in the current organization I'm in, the UX member gets a notification when it goes into, we have a design acceptance phase for the ticket. And they get to do one of two things with it. Well, first of all, they can have a conversation, ask questions. They have to be able to review the design. And then they have the authority to send it back to in progress to say, no, you're not done. And they add a comment about why. And then they have the authority to send it on to QA. So it's really important that the UX person has that authority and that they have an environment that they can do a real time review of the whatever it is that they're reviewing. And that can happen in multiple ways. That can be very, very fast. Sometimes we just jump on a quick Zoom call, the developer shows, the designer asks questions, they're done in 5 minutes. Sometimes
So
it's we need a whole test environment. And so we'll do that and have a whole test environment. So, but you
hi.
need to have some way to do that. I'm sorry, we're at 5 minutes.
We're five
I'm
minutes
almost done.
past.
I'm
Shall
good.
we shall we wrap?
I think I have 4 more minutes, don't I? I'm almost done,
Okay.
right? I'll be done shortly.
Okay.
I will be done shortly. I thought I had till
We're
1:50.
we're past we're past time. We're over time right now.
I thought it was 50. It was 20 to 50. No, it's 20 minutes. Okay, there's my summary. There's my email address. We're done. I'm sorry. I got my timing off. You're right. It's 20
No
minutes.
worries at all.
I talked very fast. No questions. I apologize. Please send me email if you have any questions. And thank you so much for your attention and your attendance.
Yeah,
Sorry about
thank you, Marilyn. Please do reach out to Marilyn via her emails. Take a quick screenshot. We're going to move on to the next session. Thank you, Marilyn.
Thank you. Apologies.